playing this game is like being in a rehearsal and a performance at the same time. It's this first time ever, or living the most intense improvisation at the same time. This feeling is guiding me. And 6 months ago, when I was preparing a lecture on a similar topic, I was so intensely thinking about it, and I started to daydream. And I realized that it was a variation on Plato's cave, but the difference was obvious. In Plato's cave, as you all know, the prisoners, they see shadows of objects which are displayed in front of them, as in theater or as in cinema. So it should be enough for them to follow the path of light, this path of enlightenment. But for various reasons, this doesn't happen, and the Western philosophy has spent pages and pages writing about this, how they could leave this dark cave of images. But in my nightmare, the shadows are no longer objects. They're images of oneself. The imprisonment feels like being caught up in a relentless rehearsal of becoming a different self. And there's no outside, there's no way out of this game that we could call searching for oneself. What I'm going to talk about tonight comes from the book that I'm co-writing with Anna Vujanović, Performing the Self, a study in social dramaturgy, and it's a sequel to our work in social choreography and social drama, which at that time was addressing the public sphere, the performance of the public sphere in those concepts. But now the shift is to this mixed public-private sphere and the life of individuals, the social life of individuals. So tonight I will focus on one of the modes of performing the self individualistically, which I will call aesthetic individualism. So each period of Western modernity yields its own version of individualism, but I believe that our epoch will be remembered for an aesthetic brand of individualism. And in a broad notion, what I mean by individualism is the standpoint which takes individual actions to be prior or superior to collective entities or interests. No, but what is distinctive about individualist understanding of the self in the current neoliberal times is a shift of bias from self-consciousness to self-affection. It means that you can no longer be ideologically blinded and then enlightened by knowledge or understanding, consciousness, if you're supposed to feel and experience the truth about yourself in your body. That embodiment reveals what words cannot say. So this is the claim that I will elaborate tonight. But let me say something about the position that I'm... Do you hear me, or should I speak louder? Let me say something about the position that I'm speaking from. Because sometimes I sit in a creation process next to a choreographer whom I'm befriending in an artistic endeavor, and this is called dramaturgy. And other times I step out of performance making in order to observe how performance could act as an instrument to observe social processes or to address social and political problems. And in this case, I'm trying to reroute dramaturgical knowledge into something that I call social dramaturgy. And this manner, I'm aware of this betraying art and artists, especially those who, for right reasons, resist instrumentalization. But for me, it is a question of maybe political urgency, and the challenge is to see, to understand how social order is instilled and rehearsed aesthetically, and whether this should be best accounted for by performance. And I will speak about dancing solo, which will be both a blueprint and sometimes a metaphor tonight. So if there's one word with which we could describe social order succinctly today, it's personalization. And I'm thinking of various registers in which the personal operates, from single leadership to customized consumership, then about individual styling individual's work, why some people are considered to be indispensable, that cannot be replaced, or why are we investing so much in thinking about collectivity and we're still operating with a single authorship and names that are branding processes. Well, what personalization entails is an arbitrariness of power and a relativism or relativization of standards. But the price for gaining freedom in personalizing decisions, choices, experiences is that every time we call on the personal, the whole person is conquered in this private-public mixture. That means that we don't regard persons in functions or in an aspect that they're responsible for, but for the total of their capacity, very often extending into exposure of their private life. So everybody knows what personal is, so I assume. It seems to me, at least from the frequent usage of this term, especially in art schools where we address personal work. But I would like to ask here, what is exactly the personal experience that individuals seek to identify with, and what is it like, how does it work, why does it work so well, that individuals recognize themselves in personal experience? Is it because it operates like a truth game, and what is aesthetic about it, about such experience, and how do we live and relate to ourselves today when we make of our bodies, our behavior, feelings, passions, a work of art? These are some of the questions I will try to answer. But for starters, which concept of the aesthetic? And here I'm drawing on a conceptual ambiguity that follows from the etymology of aesthesis, which on the one hand entails sensation, the hedonistic pleasure in which the body satisfies its interest, like in eating or having sex or immersing oneself in a dance or a ritual. And the root of the word interest is here to be in the midst, inter esse. So it's directed to the subject. And on the other hand, aesthesis designates perception as in disinterested contemplation of form, the Kantian conception of aesthetic judgment, without interest. So this antithesis of the two notions of the aesthetics carries into personal experience in the way that we would ask ourselves, with which idea does personal experience align? Is it supposed to satisfy our self-interest, or do we approach personal experience in an experiment, something autonomous from our needs? So this dilemma between utility and autonomy that lies at two rival conceptions of the aesthetic that I will call on here, and I will refer to them as the pragmatist and the experimental. So let's say that the familiar pragmatist version harks back to John Dewey's claim that every experience in itself is in itself aesthetic. To give the right quote here, experience is in the degree in which it is experienced is heightened vitality, because experience is the fulfillment of an organism in its struggles and achievements in a world of things. It is art in germ. So on this view, every experience is art-like because the normal physiological processes of humans in the living environment become more intense in art. For an anecdote, Dewey was practicing Alexander technique. So Dewey believed that art must recover its place in everyday life if it endowed all life with an intensified sense of immediate living. So the prime characteristic of this conception would be the continuum between art and life. And when Dewey was writing about this, he wasn't aware of historical avant-gardes that formulated this into a principle of art into life. So any worker who develops their skills and tools with care, with intelligence and affection is as engaged as an artist. So what is the great value for Dieu is the democratic realization of the subjects through aesthetic self-fulfillment. So in the 60s and 70s, this translated into various artistic programs that called for everyone to become an artist, as Joseph Beuys also famously asked for. But how does this translate into culture today? And we're in London, and this is a laboratory for cultural policy and participation, so I don't need to say much about this. But just to select one aspect that illustrates this version of aesthetic experience that is sought after in museums is that already in 2014 there has been a worry about visitors spending little time on average per exhibit because they're anxious hunting masterpieces in vast collections, and so museums started to organize slow art tours. Now, we would expect that the emphasis would be on mediating art through more historical, critical, theoretical knowledge. But in fact, it was about providing visitors with tips and tools for curating their own experience. So museums started to encourage visitors to take a personal approach, choose what resonates with you, not what's most famous. You might emerge feeling refreshed and inspired rather than depleted. You don't need to think you have to behave in a certain way. You can actually be you. And I would like to take as an example of this an experiment of applying positive psychology at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, which was investigated for the so-called restorative environment, restorative of mental health. So the subject of the experiment was also a professor of psychology herself who reported on her experience. Initially, nothing in the Barnes grabbed me. Then I spotted a beautiful, melancholy woman with red hair like my own. It was Toulouse-Lautrec's painting of a prostitute. I think I have it here. I was trying to figure out why she had such a severe look on her face. As the minutes passed, I found myself mentally writing the woman's story, imagining that she felt trapped and unhappy yet determined. Over her shoulder, Toulouse-Lautrec painted a window. There's an escape, I thought. You just have to turn around and see it. I was actually projecting a lot of me and what was going on in my life at that moment into that painting. It ended up being a moment of self-discovery. So here, what we see something that curators and art institutions have been preoccupied with for a decade is an expectation of the aesthetic experience to deliver a mechanism by which the individual can reappropriate themselves. And this is by even applying, let's say, a commercial version of the romantic theory of empathy, of Einfühlung, emotionalist self-expression of the subject. And I think you know this probably better even than me, because London was the first laboratory for this Tate Modern, with its screens screaming at you, leave your mark, create your own image. So this is this democratic idea of continuity, of the continuum of the aesthetic experience, how it plays out neoliberally. But there's another idea, diametrically opposed to the idea of continuity, the idea of aesthetic experience in which intensity is the prime characteristic. And it's thanks to its power to do exactly the opposite. Rather than consolidate or give you a strengthened sense of self after the sublime, aesthetic experience is there to shatter and to dissipate, to dissolve the self. In an interview in 1971, Michel Foucault, who's probably the latest opponent of this line of thinking that draws back from Nietzsche through Bataille, Klosowski, wrote, it is possible that the rough outline of a future society is supplied by the recent experiences with drugs, sex, communes, other forms of consciousness, and other forms of individuality. If scientific socialism emerged from the utopias of the 19th century, it is possible that a real socialization will emerge in the 20th century from experiences. An aesthetic experience here returns in the form of a radical life experiment. And we are talking here about descent from normative life into experimentation with different kinds of excess, in sex, as in BDSM, group BDSM practices, in madness, in near-death intoxication. So this is about pushing one's own experience to the extreme in which life might no longer be possible, by giving oneself to this limitless abandonment in this Nietzschean, Dionysian sense, in the sense that Bataille was writing, be that ocean, be that desert. The aesthetic experience not only challenges, but it overcomes, shatters a strong notion of oneself. And what other goal should experience have than to be something you come out of changed? This was the maxim that Foucault was living after. So this limit experience of Foucault foregrounded intensity as the chief parameter of one's aesthetics of existence, which in the 70s was a response to the crisis of subjectivity, radical life experiment. But today this extreme intensity has normalized in a milder, more neutralized, commercialized version. So intensity drives production and consumption, communication too, even emancipation, even activism. And so it is also part of the specific techniques that individuals use to understand themselves, the techniques that individuals operate in their bodies and souls in pursuit of freedom and happiness. And these techniques make up truth games, the goal of which is not to discover, but to produce truth out of experience. So the experience here is neither true or false, but a kind of fiction, something constructed in reflection after it has been a reality. Now, just to give an operative definition of intensity here, I mean here a difference in charge, a difference of charge or energy through time. Intensity resists identity in a subtle manner because it determines one's relationship to oneself, or that the same thing becomes different in time, a minimal difference of two versions of oneself. Now, the characteristic arena in which intensity becomes part of truth game is work, especially in freelance work style, because of the blurred boundaries between work and non-work, work and life, work and leisure. And I've examined various cases, also studying for a film essay in collaboration with Marta Popivoda, searching for rhythms in which we can represent this intensification of work and an intensified relation to oneself. But I will just briefly sketch three distinct narratives in three figures. And the first one is probably the closest to us here because it lies in the domain of the arts, of independent artist, freelance artist, cultural worker, independent scholar, researcher, independent curator. So someone who works in culture under temporary contracts. Or we could say differently, it reveals a subject who regularly extends their work hours into unpaid time and where work and free time become indistinguishable, often playing out through investing one's energies, one's feelings, one's intelligence, intellect beyond measure. And this kind of work is intensified because it is atomized through multitasking activities, which are all subsumed under networking, nothing other but performing oneself in the right place at the right time. So on the one hand, we have the image of the dedicated artist or cultural worker who would also do it for no money. And on the other hand, as the theater maker Jan Ritzema argued compellingly, we have an army of artists, distinguished not for their work, but for a certain lifestyle. I quote, the artist is the master of their own time and space. And in Ritzimer's ambivalent picture, it is the artist is the prototype of a future workforce, someone who accepts low income because of their preference for a lifestyle. Permanently on holiday, but managing the work 24/7 all by themselves, but not without capital holding power over the profit lines. So here we have a range between opportunism on the one hand and conversely a desperate precarity or self-precarization. But how do we assess this self-performance? We usually use the term generosity. This person is generous because she's giving all of herself, giving her all. If she gives a lot of herself. What distinguishes artists in this freelance regime of work is a surplus of enthusiasm. And this is what I hear also from other professions, how they observe it. The other narrative comes from probably other high end of freelance starting work. We're talking about highly paid knowledge work in finance sector, in international trade law, hedge funds, investment banking, IT. So there's a counterintuitive relation there. The higher the income these subjects receive, the harder they choose to work. One of the interviewees in my study was a former dancer, now employed in the financial district of Wall Street, and she explains that how, when she was dancing, she used to work only as much as she needed to support herself, while she spent the rest of her time dancing. Once she started her job in the finance, the peer pressure of her colleagues made her work increasingly more beyond earning for a living. Now we're talking about 120 hours per week, electronically available 24/7. And to sum up many techniques of the self that sustain this work, we can conclude that the workers in this knowledge work sector are approached as artists. They're asked to have projects, they work with deadlines, they extemporize, they learn to improvise, they internalize competition with themselves. They don't need any more external managerial control because they compete against themselves. And there are many other also bodily techniques like biohacking or also specific architectural dispositives that make, or apparatuses that make this work possible. So what is most striking is that they're prepared to undergo extreme experiences that are felt physically in order to maintain a high standard of performance. So intensity obviously grows until meltdown, and 7 years of work at the average age of 35 has been recognized as the burnout point, after which there is a career reorientation towards becoming health executives or professional adventure sportsmen, which is my third narrative, or third model of intensity. Also, to sum it up quite briefly, the subjects of extreme sports, what kind of performances of intensity do they undergo as part of their truth games? It's comparable with a revamped version of being the narrative of the romantic bourgeois man of Sturm und Drang, who walks away from corrupt society into nature because nature is this more innocent and sacred place, rather than to struggle against the hypocrisy of social relations, false individuals. So as a performance and as a truth game, we have here the contemporary version of trial by ordeal. So it's the ritual by which the guilt or innocence of the accused was determined by subjecting them to an unpleasant, usually dangerous experience. There are many biblical stories. It's part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. But in difference to these medieval trials of ordeal, the trial of extreme sport is self-imposed, and it functions as a mode of action that an individual voluntarily exercises upon themselves. So the truth about oneself is born out of an intensive experience of survival, of immersing oneself in a difficult situation where one is challenged by nature to test personal resources of endurance, force, courage. So we could capture it in something like I've done Himalaya, and currently people are dying in competition, queuing to reach the top, or like I've done Vietnam, or I've done Wall Street, or I've performed in So You Think You Can Dance, or I've performed for Marina Abramovic, I've performed for Tino Zegel. These are, I suppose, the phrases in which we can capture this type of ritual. So, what is the truth game of intensity? First of all, it is to be intensely what one is, or to live fully, as the French philosopher Tristan Garcia pointed out. This supposes that one believes to be the subject of how one lives, or how one works, or how one works, lives to work, in fact. Because the intensity of my life is something only I can own and measure for myself. An experience of intensity in these narratives is primarily physical. It's about testing a limit of one's capacity, which is supposed to provide one with a physical proof of an intensified feeling of presence. As if just living or working with a certain measure won't suffice, but has to be supported by proofs of performance. But in this game, what does it mean to perform oneself? And has the performance of the self changed, at least the usage, the pragmatics of the verb to perform? The statement, "you lack potential," is much more devastating than "you messed up," because it makes a more fundamental claim about who you are. This is what Richard Sennett wrote. So, in performing oneself, the focus is no longer on the act or the effect of one's performance, but on the potential for action. Performing here means to show one's performability. So to jump to dance for a moment, in how many solos what you're actually looking at is not a dance, but a dancer performing their ability to perform. And this gives a particular circular twist to the formula. I'm performative to the extent that I can use my abilities and show them to others, that I can sense this myself, that I can feel or be affected by my performance. Thus not only rendering visible, but also controlling the effect of my performance. So it's about self-monitoring performability. Now, what of the self that is produced in performance in such a way? And I think that it's fair to say that we're talking here about a negative assumption. It's both political and ontological assumption of lack of presence and lack of achievement that drives the performance of one's human capital. And to add on a list of fears that have defined the crisis talk of our era, we could say that it's also a fear of desubjectivation, of not being subject enough. So that means, to put it simply, that one relates to themselves as unaccomplished, underachieved, which makes them constantly search for opportunities to express or narrate themselves. I recall here a sentence from a film from Jean-Luc Godard from the 70s, where he says, "We're given the positive in order to make the negative, and that is, of course, a pun if you think about the film tape, the positive which is made into a negative. But now I'm suggesting the reverse. In performing oneself, the starting point is the negative. It's like a deficit on your bank account from which existence must be earned, its proofs accumulated, assessed, because definitive achievement disappears from the horizon. Instead, the process must continue indefinitely, and it's endless and limitless, because performing the self in this sense equals one's maintenance of potential qua potential. Now, having said all this, it seems that there's nothing more to add. It's pretty much closing up this story, but I've also promised an alternative which I will arrive at. Something crucial is missing in this account, and that's about how, in which form, with which techniques, is there a genre to this performance of individuals? And perhaps it will help us understand why it is difficult to denounce individualism, aesthetic individualism as an ideology. What is the reason why it is felt to be real, to the extent that you cannot enlighten someone by just saying to them, don't you see how you're individualistic in your thoughts, passions, actions, stop being it. And that's because there is embodiment. And so could the role of embodiment in performing the self be described as dancing solo? And what can we learn from dancing solo? So that's my proposal, to regard solo dance as a form of social choreography, not as an artistic genre. And of course I spare many solo dances that have contested individualism, so they're certainly not counted here. But I take the solo dance as a blueprint, which of course suffers from a reduction, from a schematization, for an individualistic performative production of the self. And I will explain it through, or present it through several principles that I extract from dancing solo. Now, the first principle is the body doesn't lie. So when it trains how to move, or in the case of also not specializing in dance, but having recourse to bodily techniques, the body acquires a techne, a know-how about its own capacity. So not only do we study how to move and sense our bodies, but subjects learn how to observe their perceptions and affections either in formal, trained ways or informally. In this way, the body is read and interpreted. It becomes an index comprised of symptoms, messages to decipher, or as American choreographer Martha Graham recommended, listen to your body, as the body doesn't lie. So it renders the body the physical repository of habits, of feelings, of thoughts that have been lived through one's life. So the body is sought as an instrument to communicate the personal, to uncover all that is intimate and private about a person. But in performing the self, it's not only this kind of subjective experience out of self-consciousness. There's also something being produced. It yields a form that is observable. And that would be the second principle. So when artifice enters the game, the body is used to shape something, whether it's a sequence of gestures, posture, speech, voice, that can be separated from its immediate experience of the self. Like a dancer who is perfecting a phrase, so is a job seeker instructed how to perform at a job interview. Like in Harun Farocki's famous 1996 documentary Interview, which is about a course for training how one solicits for a job, how one performs oneself. Or if it's just about some person posting stuff about themselves on social media. All these situations involve an observable form of performance, something that can also be evaluated, even quantified. Now, at the core of solo dance is the phenomenological condition described by Maurice Merleau-Ponty as chiasma, or as the intertwining of the subject and the object, meaning that the body and is partly coincides or conflated with the self. And this self-relation has been described as auto-affection, which occurs when one affects oneself, when the affector is the same as the affected. So auto-affection for me is the third principle. The hand that touches is touched, as Merleau-Ponty pointed out. So solo is the form that best entertains this illusion of self-proximity, that there is no external detour between moving one's body and sensing one's body move, or seeing oneself in the mirror, or hearing oneself speak, all that was critiqued by Derrida as phonocentrism. Now, here is an example that I suppose that you all know and that we can trace from the end of 19th century towards today, and that's the first manuals of Delsartism that were meant to advise how to perform oneself before others, and applied the Delsart's theory of gestures, where subjects are instructed to practice their postures and facial expressions in front of the mirror, because it's not only about gaining self-awareness, but also controlling the effect you have on the other. This I find hilarious, one of the rare images of Delsart. And this was renewed in the 80s particularly. I think we can link it up with the rise of neoliberal capitalism. I don't have that. This is one of the taxonomy of the hand gestures in Delsart. So this kind of semiotics and body coaching, where famous actors became coaches of performance in a managerial business context. And in the 90s, it was, of course, overcome with a culturalist turn, because the science was considered to be contingent upon cultures. And nowadays, it only survives in the body coaching of the high-profile, for instance, presidential candidates. But the aim of Delsartism was to enable subjects to control how others perceive them. That means that it denies this gap between I and me, the subject and the self. This gap that makes me always appear to myself as the other, as strange, as uncanny. So performing oneself here tries to minimize the gap, which is constitutive, obviously. And the fourth principle of performing solo is perhaps not only specific to dance, but to any solo performance, and it's the principle of speaking in the first person singular, or I am my own story. So if I say I on stage, this implies perhaps three different modes of address and kinds of self-narration. Either my statement is singular, so my story only belongs to me, or I stand as an example, or I'm a token of a type. I'm a unique specimen of an East European white cis woman who speaks too much. So nowadays, perhaps out of these three modes of address, what's most popular is a quest for singularity, because it eventually replaces the category of identity with intensity, as intensity can better represent this irrational and elusive character of difference in itself. I cannot coincide with me in a definitive way. So my attempts of joining these two facets will always be an open-ended process. I will always be chasing this me. And this dynamic of the open-ended process requires some stability, and it finds it in territory as one's property, projecting oneself in a place. This is my fifth principle. In his famous essay that was supposed to be about dance, but then instrumentalized dance for thought, Dance as a Metaphor for Thought by Alain Badiou, a figure of a wheel that turns on itself is described. I don't know if I have the quote here. Yes. Like a circle in space, that is its own principle, a circle that is not drawn from the outside, but rather draws itself. Circle is a recurrent spatial figure in 20th century dance. You can just remember there's the Kessmacher's violin fixer for solo, or a more contemporary version of Daniel Linehan's this fascinating spinning solo, Not About Everything. Perhaps in visual arts it is not a circle, but it's a square. But the enclosure delineates this space that exclusively belongs to that person. You know this in when you're improvising with someone on stage, and they say, "Is it my space, your space?" And this space can be a matter of any kind of support, whether it's a studio or a room of one's own, which marks in Virginia Woolf's famous essay, The Emancipatory Feminist Stance, that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she's to write fiction. Territory is also a web page or someone's Instagram account. We're talking about an abstract concept here. Admittedly, these are all different venues, but the principle is the same, that the self finds support in a territory as it grows from the inside, like in a spider's web, from its center occupied by the self. So it enables one to project and manage oneself as a site and as an object. I was tempted, and I wanted to go longer and to provoke the somatic practices, and especially dancers who identify with it, but I decided maybe to skip this provocation for a shorter lecture here, because there's much more to say about what sustains the practice of embodiment on a regular basis, and which is sourced from body work and movement studies today in their therapeutic, commercial, also spiritual function. But instead, I would like to suggest another social dramaturgy, which questions dancing solo as I described it here. So are there situations and ways in which our personal performances are not individual? Is there something else to perform than my individual self, or this identification with life and its intensity that can only belong to me? And what would it mean to perform trans-individually? And when I ask these questions, I think we need perhaps another setting to imagine it. And I would like to return to 2011 and the times of social movements against austerity, where one of the slogans on Syntagma Square said, "No one will be left alone in the crisis." This principle of solidarity, and the Greek word alleleki literally means close to each other, posits the common first. The common not as a political interest, not as a general interest, common not the common of the goods that we must share equally, but something that is more ontological to consider. And I mean here the pre-individual base, or some kind of reservoir, pool of generic capacities, which are natural and historical at the same time, which we inherit as a species being, as Marx called Gattungswesen. And it is also regenerating and accompanying the pre-individual, a trans-individual production of forms of life and work in which we collectively change. So, in which actions do I and we change together in relation to each other? In which actions do I perform trans-individually? Two examples that I'll shortly invoke here. One is historical and one is from our times. So in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, a black woman refused to cede her seat to a white passenger. You all recognize this image of Rosa Parks. And it's besides the point, the argument whether this was a spontaneous act or whether it was a prepared one. What's important is that the discourse of black activism transformed her behavior into a clear act of public defiance, and which led to the massive Montgomery bus boycott. So Rosa Parks' act trans-individuated not only the social group she belonged to, but transformed the society in a performatively disruptive way. At that point, performing of the self transcends the individualistic horizon and becomes trans-individual. In 2018, a Swedish student tried to stop the deportation of an Afghan asylum seeker from Sweden in Gothenburg. Her name is Alina Schon, and she stood up in the aircraft and appealed to the pilot to use his right to refuse to take off as long as the Afghan asylum seeker was on plane. And she was defending this with the argument that if he leaves, his destiny will be death. But as an activist, she carefully studied the procedural choreography of her performance, which turned out more dramatic and conflictual because it divided the response of passengers into support by those who applauded and stood up to join her, and into hostile complaints of those passengers who urged her to sit down or tried to grab her phone that she used to record her performance. In the end, her act was only partly successful, or in that part where it stopped the deportation at that moment, but not entirely. But beyond that, what her performance showed in an exemplary manner is that it is possible to defy juridical decisions and not even break the law in the name of a political principle. So in this viral video, we see Alina Schon holding back her tears when her action wins the approval of many passengers and the asylum seeker is taken off the plane. Nowadays, individuals in political protest are often caught in effective expression. And as individuals, they are vulnerable. They risk to be framed and marginalized. We have seen how the right wing tries to dismiss Greta Thunberg's poignant speeches on account of her condition. By contrast, the performances of affect, rage, outrage, indignation, when they become massive, they cannot be dismissed so easily because they often trigger a process of trans-individuation, which then has all successive stages of a social drama, which means that it contests a social order, it opens it up and gives a chance for it to be reconstituted. So, studying performances of the self, we probably cannot get rid of performance as such, as long as we live in capitalism as a global condition. But it also means that while performing ourselves, we do not have to be preoccupied with ourselves as individuals, especially when the common becomes more urgent. So while activist examples of Rosa Parks and Elina Schron set the bar high on political activism, which not everyone is prepared or capable of doing, at least they remind us that from time to time we can ask ourselves, what can I do insofar as I'm not alone? And the question doesn't concern political action only, but everything that we could do together, even just make a performance. And I'm using here the modal verb can instead of saying must or should, or although I have a kind of East European Marxist reflex to say what must be done, what must we do together. But if we as individuals come from individuating the common, so if we reverse the perspective and not start from the individual or reconstruct backwards the process of individuation into the common, if we start from the common that we individuate, and that which comes before us and continues to exist after us, if we do not regenerate the common, how will we still have the potential to go beyond our individual selves? That's the question that I would like to end this talk with. Thank you.
Questions?
Oh, comments.
Can you repeat the last sentence you said, just so it kind
of. My last question is: if we don't invest in the common, if we don't regenerate the common, how will we be able to go beyond ourselves? If that is also the goal that is posited as a horizon of individuals' self-growth, which is the drive of neoliberal capitalism. My question is, can we perform ourselves trans-individually? Or are we going to exhaust this luxury of loneliness as individuals in capitalism?
which we're doing now.
I think it's a privileged relation. It's also a social relation. Alienation is a social relation, and being an individual is what's made possible by them.
Mm-hmm.
But you mean in general in life or in performance?
I mean in general.
In general, yeah.
I think I was speaking I was not speaking like you might have expected of me, because I work in performance and dance, and but I found it more urgent and interesting to throw this at you tonight than.
So I just have a question though.
Yes.
To you, but it's because you said something about if we are still talking about performance, it still relates to neoliberalism, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But performance existed before neoliberalism.
Of course.
What do you mean by that? Actually, I wasn't sure what you mean.
I mean that with capitalism and modernity in general, we might ask ourselves how ideology operates. Is it only social and political, or does it use aesthetic means? And if there is an aesthetic operation of ideology, that means that ideology is not on a kind of superstructural level, but is that operating directly at the level of the body, so at the base. And I'm certainly not the first one who has observed this. My intercessors in this case are Siegfried Krakauer's notion of mass ornament, and I can give you a little clue about that, and that is observing a kind of isomorphism between mass ornament on stadium dancing, or the revue dancing of the famous Stiller Girls, talking about the early entertainment in the 20s and 30s of the previous century, and working on the assembly line, so the fragmentation, technical division of competencies in production. And Krakauer, who's a German Jewish journalist, was affiliated with Frankfurt Institute for Sociology, observed, let's say, a similarity, similar form. If this is the case, that means that ideology operates differently than we think. It's not about false consciousness. It's not about distortion. It's about doing. It's about a sheer mechanism, a repetition of a ritual. And my question was, what is it today? What is the defining ideology of our times? There are probably several vying, but the one that is dominant and that is the fuel of capitalism is individualism. And there are many variants of individualism since the end of 18th century onwards, or maybe even from Renaissance times. So I was particularly looking into what are the tools that I have as someone who is trained in this field to understand social processes of behavior in terms of social anthropology as well, which is where performance was originally also established. Richard Schechner together with Victor Turner and so on. This is maybe the broader genealogy of this method of social dramaturgy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, maybe just a question. I'm trying to, the question you left us here. Is it possible, right, to perform trans individually or trans individuation? I guess I'd like to redirect perhaps the question to you, because it's a question I have for myself in my practice. Maybe it's a methodological question, which is how much do we need to rehearse maybe the conditions, all of these conditions in which we've outlined so kind of clearly and kind of harshly, we see how it functions, like individuality here. But I'm thinking, a few times along your talk, you just pointed to the fact, for instance, when you were talking about dance and solo, that there are some works, some artists who are working against others, who are proposing other strategies. So probably these, there are moments where we might work alongside some practices that are doing that, right? So I guess my question is, how much do we need to start from the individual perspective or position, right, in order to understand how it works to then perform something else, right? Or do we need to start elsewhere?
I believe that we should attempt elsewhere, but for a long time I've been thinking collectivism and collectivity as a positively identified with ideology, and it comes from my heritage, where I come from. So a Leninist approach to ideology would be that there's also ideology of the working class. And the experience has taught me that this is not, it's not the reality. It doesn't, so this kind of collectivity, which is based on a common program and representation, will not help, because individuals will always separate themselves. And also presupposes division between the and kind of securing the boundary between private and public life. We don't live like that anymore. Public and private spheres have mixed to a certain degree. So that's why I'm trying to bring it more to the level of desire and imagination, in which we recognize the common in cooperation, and in the fact that there is a multiplicity of differences, where we are maybe not individuals, but we singularly modify this common, instead of representing it in a transcendent fashion, where I'm more French than you, or I'm better at this than that. So you see what I mean? So I've been thinking this. I didn't bring this on in this lecture, but I've been working for a long time on Gilbert Simondon, read together with Etienne Balibar, Transindividuality in Spinoza, and this is my take on a kind of, let's say, reciprocity of the individual and collective individuation. Because where communism has failed is that it just didn't leave enough space for individuality. Now, within that, many other alliances are possible, and I think it has to be instituted publicly through everything that used to be the public good, education, art, healthcare, and so on. These are big issues, but they're defining social political issues of our times, especially when right wing is winning, and it's winning with individualism, and it's terrible to see how much success it has with the working class, because it offers that model. And we cannot ask for class consciousness anymore, because that doesn't work. So that type of collective individuation under class or under any category that's supposed to unite in a representative manner won't work. So I have reverted to this species being. But I know that a lot of people from post-humanism will jump at me and say, what do you mean by species being? What about other species? And yes, there is also milieu, there is an environment, because individuation is not just inter-individuation, but it's also about the milieu that supports, the environment that supports it. There's a question there?
Yeah, it was a very, very dense talk, and I'm still thinking about loads of things that you've mentioned. But just from what you said about new materialism, looking at species being, I think the examples that you brought up, the circular metaphors in dance, and then linking it to the politics of singularity, collectivism, and the climate change crisis, and the revolts, sorry, what do you call them? Protests.
Yeah, revolts is also good.
Yeah, and I think, so I guess my question is, because you also, you were quite historical in the references you mentioned, what the question of humanism, instead of asking about the species being, like the human, the role of the human, and how that can be, is still the main agent of making concepts, trying to understand concepts. And
yes.
How do you see?
Do you think I'm a humanist? That's behind your question.
I think that's quite interesting, because you said that materials, when you mention them, I automatically have to think about post-humanism, which I think is very different from the political kind of human-centered post-Marxism that you try to erase the capitalist.
I'm not prepared to answer you now. I'm sorry. I think that my critique is probably anti-humanist, but whether it's I'm not sure if I don't feel competent enough to draw relations to new materialism in this case, because I'm primarily looking at forms of social organization and the political, and I don't see. I'm an ardent reader of Isabel Stenger's, but more on the let's say philosophical questions of knowledge than in the practices that she refers to in her collaborations with Donna Haraway or Vincent Després and others. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you for this very rich talk, and I'm also still grappling with this question that you threw us at us at the end. Yeah, I'm going to try to formulate my question, which I think is related to this idea of regenerating the common and how it relates to social dramaturgy. Because I think it's really interesting how you show that kind of this promise of Foucault of actually that a form of life can actually be the emancipation from from capitalism and from different ways that the social is constricting us, actually has become this triviality, which is then like kind of the new norm, that like that we this like is life as an ecstatic existence where you create yourself all the time and constantly recreate yourself, and that this actually become kind of the prison, but which in a way also is a response to socialism and to and to this as you say, as a common that does not allow for any mode of individuation. So I am just also really interested in this idea of what would another vision of what the common is and how to enact the common together. I think it's interesting, and maybe now I'm reading something into what you said that you didn't say, but that this idea that there might be a sociality already at play, which can kind of be tapped into and can be activated in different ways instead of being subsumed under orders and rules and regulations that we set for it, which actually enacts individualism instead of countering it. And I'm just curious there how social dramaturgy plays in, if that's just a way of observing these things, or if it's also a kind of an operationality, let's say, because I could just say one more thing is that I was curious about your examples, which, I mean, this is fantastic, this action that I forgot her name, that the Swedish girl, yeah. Which in a way, when I saw the first time, okay, this is actually this is a solo performance, and then that it's a solo performance, like that she really enacts an individual act, but in a way, the way that she ends up actually activating people in that plane, in a way, you could also describe her as an actant, that she is actually something that she sets something into motion, and this for me is just interesting in terms of dramaturgy, because that is something that is now is become more a practice of something that's enacted between different agents, and you cannot really say that it belongs to a specific person. So that is more different operators that enacts on each other. And I'm just curious from you and also from your practice of dramaturgy, I mean, how was this, is social dramaturgy also, is that also a, maybe not methodology, but an operationality?
I'm not an activist. I'm a citizen. I do my civic duty, and I also protest when most people protest. So I don't approach this social dramaturgy as a principle that I'm advocating for activism. I think activists know better. They know what they're doing. I'm maybe observing things and trying to understand them. I think my weapons are on the page only. So what I can construct as tools, and it's as little or as much as that. So, but for instance, I noticed that at a certain point, many practitioners, choreographers started referring to their work as social choreography. And I thought that was a mistake. That was an error to turn it into a genre, because socially engaged art is not necessarily what is meant by this concept that was coined by Andrew Hewitt, and that had a very, very specific definition of an aesthetic operation of ideology. So. Because it also plays into this political art, or it's also a form of instrumentalism. I also believe in art for its own sake, so I would defend that. But I also think that doing that doesn't absolve us from our duties as citizens. So to me, it's in that sense I'm split. I'm speaking about social dramaturgy in the sense of humanities and that kind of research. I don't necessarily, because at the moment we are protesting in Brussels, we are organizing actions against budget cuts, and all the other reforms that are in store for us with the right wing that has taken over. And one thing is that we are not repeating the mistake to aestheticize the protest. The protest cannot be manifestation. It has to be long prepared and not compromising. Because this is also what politics wants. There's a great danger in aestheticizing politics. So this is something that I refrain from. So.
Sorry, what do you mean by aestheticizing politics?
Well, fascism aestheticized politics. That's a clear example.
With a certain aesthetic of like marching together, chanting together, you mean that?
Yes, or look at the work of Leni Riefenstahl, or the instrumentalization of Wagner, Nietzsche. That's a kind of instrumentalism.
You mean like
that
by referring to certain aesthetic of what a protest or a march would be, to resist, to fall into a stereotype of what a march is? Or what?
No, it means that it just uses its power of seduction with aestheticism. So, and I think that.
No, but do you mean like you are refusing in Brussels to
for instance, meet in the parliament and perform for the ministers to show them what we do? There's no reason for that. It's a waste of energy. It's a kind of event that expends itself. We need long-term struggle. This is what political activism is about. It's not about me feeling good at the square in front of the parliament performing for the minister to show them that they don't know what art is. Do you understand?
Yeah, but I'm not sure. You mean like actually not performing in front of like. I don't, because for me, wait, sorry, I explain. For me, there are two different things. Like, I understood what you mean by not aesthetic politics, by not performing, by not doing typical march. What a typical march is people chanting in the street, for example. That could be a march, like a protest. People go on the street, they march and they chant a slogan, something. But now what you say is actually performance, or like sharing what art is. That's another thing.
I mean that aestheticization is distracting. It will distract us from real political goals.
Okay, like from the content, you mean?
For what the demands are. What are political demands? If you protest it in your life, then you understand that there's a line you draw and you're demanding something. And if you're performing there, it's making it not serious.
Okay, you mean like performing, like actually doing a performance?
Sorry,
I'm trying to understand you. I'm here to understand you.
Yeah,
sorry.
It's using also
I'm not sorry,
forms.
actually.
So look, when this happened in the Netherlands, where there were extreme cuts, where there was for the arts, because the minister said that art is the hobby of the left. Artists organized the march, and then they spent hours thinking how nice walk they will make through the woods, and how nice it will be to arrive at the place, but go the other way because they're artists and they're creative, and they're going to meander through the park instead of blocking the road or standing. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
so in that sense, aestheticization is embellishment, is feeling good. Also, as an artist, that you're doing something that also looks like what you that resembles your artistic activity. No, you have to put another hat on.
Yeah, I understand.
There was just Danielle.
Thank you, Bojana. And my question is about, I wonder what the relationship is between thinking about performing trans-individuality and performing plurality. Whether performing trans-individuality is similar or different to philosophies of plurality, the third person, or whether they're similar. Is it a way to maintain a place from which to speak from the I, and then make connections that connect with other individuals, or is it a place that sort of dissolves the I and therefore creates a plurality where we enter into a different understanding of the person.
Do you mean plurality rather than pluralism? Or do you mean pluralism? Because if it's pluralism, then certainly not, because then it's about negotiation.
I think I mean plurality.
Plurality in the sense of Jean-Luc Nancy, of being singular plural.
Or, esposito.
Or esposito. I think that there's some similarity there, but examples of trans-individuation for me are social movements, and there's not much place for I there, although everyone finds their place, why they are there. But if the common is, I should say, foregrounded, then I think individual is secondary. I've been looking also into politics of prefiguration and alternative communities, because there are many people nowadays. There's a strong movement of leaving the cities, for instance, and defining another ethics of existence. But very often these are enclosed communities where individuals play a role, like in a play, where you can also find social drama scripts. Why they find themselves where they are, what is their individual motivation. So I'm not sure that is for me, that's a form of alternativism that doesn't take society as an anonymous and plural totality. Of course, every totality includes a miscount, who is included, so it is also a process there of defining what. One of the most interesting examples for me is municipal movements in Spain, where there's a public civic partnership between individuals who are not all citizens, also some clandestine people who form institutions, who politically organize, and who speak to the state in public institutions. So that's something, maybe some middle ground in which these processes are being successful. I don't know if I answered.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very intriguing talk. It's a lot of food for thoughts. What I was wondering is, and I totally agree, I think we need more of the common, because if individuality is taken further, then it's becoming too self-harming. But I was wondering where sits some, it seems to me, but I might have misunderstood you, that this common is something that is how is it organized? Is it from the individuals, or is it supposed to be thought as a political movement? And thinking about capitalism versus socialism, what you said, so how far do we go to give people some sort of common by a higher order, and then we have discovered it doesn't work because single individuals always want to outdo others by the way we are somehow function as humans. And yet, if it's taken to the extreme with neoliberalism, also there is lately this very good book by this dramaturg of the Leipzig State Theatre who said, like, can't recall this, but where he said, stop blaming neoliberalism for what goes wrong. And I also wonder where this plays the role of a sort of psychology. Also, I know psychology has its dangers to be yet again an ideology, but if I, for example, think about people who I regarded once as my friends who do this outperforming you were describing, like going on high mountains in Nepal or working like 80 to 90 hours a week, then I somehow feel it's there's also something which is psychologically unresolved. So it's not just about making money or showing, it's about making money and showing to others that I'm supposed to be this likable individual. But there's also something else, that the need is there, that they have this very strong need that they go to these extremes.
Mm.
So I keep wondering this kind of human psychology, where does it fit in this model of philosophy, politics, and performance?
I will probably revert more to a metaphysical notion of the common here, and that is if the common is pre-individual, then it's something that is given, that is a heritage, and that is that look, we how is it that humans are capable of learning a language? They speak, they have a language, right? There's an institution of language. We're born amidst the language, okay. We are also born with a sensory apparatus which is the same. Then, even if artists claim the difference, there is we share the same habits of perception. They might historically change in their representation in what Rancière calls the sensorium, the distribution of the sensible. And then there is a mode of production, which is more historical than natural. This is also what we inherit. And that is the common. This is the common as Paulo Virno defines it, thinking Simondon together with Marx. He gives a name to this pre-individual. In Simondon's philosophy, pre-individual is similar to the pre-Socratic notion of apeiron, of the unlimited nature. And this unlimited nature is the common that precedes and that is regenerated and produced also trans-individually in collective individuation. I don't have a remedy, and I'm not. And I don't. And you are right that psychology plays a role, and there are some good social psychologists writing, like Alain Ehrenberg, who wrote about depression in the 90s. I think that we have shifted from that syndrome of depression to anxiety. So there's an anxiety around this desubjectivation, which I think also drives these extreme performances of the self. This in German, this is Leistung, and that describes it the best. It's achievement. There's also a Swiss-Korean philosopher, Chan, who speaks about this achievement subjects and achievement society, and I think that there are other, the world is big, so there are other cultures in which there's a history of social practices which doesn't permit such developments of individual performances. Yeah.
I'm not. I mean, your question was, if we do not invest in the common, how can we go beyond ourselves? No, is that the question? Okay. I was just curious because you showed 2 examples of one person doing an act of performance. Because, for example, Extinction Rebellion or even the whole rave movement, Reclaim the Street.
Yes.
They were all trans-individual. They were not about.
I agree. Yes.
And maybe you would put it into activism, but even the rave movement wasn't necessarily activism. It was actually, it's performance, it's art, it's collective joy, it's collectivity. It's being physical together, and I don't know. Also because you refer a lot. Like and what you mean is a common, because you, like, even living in a housing cooperative or squatting is a form of the common, or gardening is a form.
Of course, but do you think that I think that there is not enough common? There is common in our society, but it's not. For instance, if you look at education and on all levels, it's not something that is implemented. Unfortunately, competition rather than solidarity is the.
But it comes from survival of the fittest, Darwin. That's already very much, and enlightenment is very much based on individualism, and that's when the whole economy started as well. In the way of the beginning of industrialism, and it's based on the idea of survival of the fittest or competition, really,
Yes.
instead of interconnection
Mm.
or the evolution through symbiosis. And I think also like with the 60s, 68, 69, the student demonstrations, Vietnam demonstrations, capitalism took on this desire of the students to, from the boredom of university, from the boredom of like what you say maybe losing individualism, which maybe was also part of communism, that you are part of a group and you maybe have to be the same. So they took on this whole idea of expressing yourself and individualism, like the freedom, but that freedom was really turned to a very extreme individualism of performing yourself, which weakened this whole idea of collective power and potential and agency. And I think, however, it's something, I don't know, like looking now at the demonstrations that are happening all over the world, in London as well, is coming back. I mean,
For sure.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm not denying this. So it's absolutely, I'm looking into it. Yeah.
I have a really light question. Really light. Anyway, I just wanted to ask you a bit about your writing process with Anna, because in a way you're two people. I don't
Yes.
know. Just how is that sort of? Have you got any sort of ways of working together somehow in the ways that you're producing, writing this book that might resonate with your own ideas? Or
we write parts of the book together, and other parts we write separately. This is how it works. It has always been like that. And if we had more time, we are suffering from not having enough. This research went on for 4 or 5 years because we didn't have any funding, and our institutional affiliations are too weak to fund our work. So the work suffers from intermittency and periods where we cannot meet or where we have to work by Skype and things like that. So we are in a way intercessors of each other, because I maybe tend more to draw from philosophy, and Anna is more of an activist. So we sort of, I think that in that sense we are very critically reading each other's pages, and that's the best thing about writing together, because at least you know one person is reading you carefully. and it, critically, and that's very important. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.